In this video, we're going to take a look at some modeling basics in Maya, starting off with our Polygon Primitives, which is what we always use at the start of a project. They're basic shapes that we can build on. On the top left-hand corner here, we have the classic cube and sphere and cylinder and a bunch of options for starting with different primitives. You can see as well from the Create menu, you can create Polygon Primitives and you have more options from here. Let's just take a wee look at this cube that I've created using my W or Move tool to move it into space here. The tabs on the right hand side, which you'll see if you have your workspace set to Maya Classic, there will be the attribute editor. And in here I can edit the attributes of the beginning primitive. So under Polycube 1, I have subdivisions for width, height and depth, and here I can toggle these up and down to change how many subdivisions we have at the beginning. And this is the same for any of the primitives that you'll create. So you can change that through the sliders or through the numbers here. The shelves here will have all of your tools, and you can quick select them using the little icons here. You can also use the tools on the left hand side. So for instance, the selection tool there can be Q on your keypad, or you can use this arrow icon. W will be your move tool, which is highlighted here. E is your scale, or your rotate tool, sorry, and R is your scale tool. Try to get used to using the keyboard shortcuts for these, but they are available on the left hand side of your screen as well. Now the last tool that you've used will be on the left hand side, just in the center here, above your panel views and below your movement and scale and rotate options. So if I hover over this, you'll see it says last tool used. I can double click this tool to get into its settings. The same with any tool that I am about to use, or if I've just used. You go into your tool settings by double clicking that little icon, or by going to your tool and then pressing the options, which is a little square to the right hand side of the option. You'll get your tool settings up and you can change how that tool works. Another really handy point about using your last tool, I'm going to use Extrude here and pull that up. Now if I want to use the last tool that I had selected again, all I need to do is press the G key, and then I can again move up. I can press G and then move up. So G is just to repeat a use of the last tool that you used. Very handy whenever you're extruding. So let's take a look at some of the options we have available to us on the right hand side. We have our channel box and layer editor here. This is where you see I've already got my references in. I'll have my layers set up here, and I can also see some basic information about the scale, rotation and translation of the object that I currently have selected. So you'll see that I can scale things by using those figures, and that will apply to only the faces or the object or the edges or whatever that you have currently selected. So let's select my entire object there, and you see I can rotate the entire object just by using the numbers available to me there. You'll also see then if you're rotating something, for example, using the gizmos, as that rotates you'll see the figure changing on the right hand side, so you know there it's the y-axis I'm rotating on. So if you need an exact rotation, you can go up here and you can type it in to that axis. Sometimes it's hard to tell the axis just by looking at the little axis icon in the left hand side, so you can always tell on the go by scaling or moving, and you can see which axis that is moving on the right hand side there. There's also a list of all of the inputs or all of the tools that I've currently used on this object. So you can see in object mode, if I select this, I have used 4 extrusions. I can see up to extrude face 4, and I can go in and look at the properties of that here. You see I can even go back to an earlier extrusion, and I can change things like the scale of that extrusion. I can change the rotation. So there's a lot of options there that we could mess around with even after a change has been made to the object. Now Maya will run slower the more objects that have all of these inputs in their history. So to clear that so that all you're left with is the geometry data and you don't have all of this history in there, you select your object in object mode, go to Edit, Delete All by Type, and then History, or delete by type in history, and it'll delete just the thing that's selected there. So if I go ahead and do that, you'll see all of that history disappears and I'm just left with the geometry. Next we're going to take a wee look down at the middle tab here, which is the modeling toolkit on the right hand side, and you'll see that it will allow us to select our vertices or our edges or our faces or object mode from that handy little menu. Now we'll be more used to holding right click and selecting those options here. See edge, object mode, face and vertex, but if you prefer to use buttons, those buttons are available to you in the modeling toolkit. There are a lot of other options you can turn on here, like symmetry, and there's also your shortcuts for a number of tools here that you will often be using. Now, a lot of them are the same as the tools along the top shelf, but for quick reference, those can be quite handy. The final menu down on the right hand side is the attribute editor. And the attribute editor with an object selected will show all of the things that make that object what it is, all the attributes. So you can go into pCylinder1, pCylinder because I started with a cylinder primitive, and I can change here the translation values, the rotation and the scale values. So if I wanted to translate or move that exactly by 1 on the y-axis, I can do that here. Also, if I move up on the y-axis, I can see that that moves in real time, the figures here. So that can be really handy for precise placement of objects. Now this translation value is related to the center point here. So I currently have my center point. It's not actually set to the bottom. If I press D, I can select that center point, hold X for snap to grid, and I'm going to snap it right down onto the bottom of the grid there. Now you'll see if I translate it to 1, it will translate it exactly 1 square of the grid upwards, or it might be easier to show on the X-axis here. If I translate that to 1, it will translate it exactly to that grid coordinate. So your midpoint is important whenever it comes to editing things in the attribute editor, as that's really the reference point about which these figures work. Then we have pCylinder shape1, and that's just some things relating to the shape that has been created. You see here you can do things like in object display, you can change the visibility. Generally these are more advanced options that we'll leave for now. Then you have the shader, which is attached to your surface material, and that's what we're going to take a look at here. The very right hand side of these options will be a Lambert or some sort of material. It will say the material name and then 1 or whatever number of material that's attached. So whenever you add a texture to your objects, that is where they'll be, in the attribute editor, and then as far right as you can go in this options window. Now you'll see that my history gets recorded if I say select these faces again and begin extruding. Okay, the history of all of that adds into my attribute editor now. So what I'll have to do if I want to select that object's material is I'll likely be way across here at pCylinder1 or pCylinder shape1. I'll have to tab across with these little arrows to get to my properties of my surface, and there you can change things like the color. Very basically, you can input a new texture using a file and then the folder, so I can upload a texture that way. Okay, so your attributes editor is really helpful for anything that pertains to the settings of this object. There are 2 different ways to select your faces, edges, or vertices. One way is to use marquee selection. So if I go into face, I can select faces by using the marquee tool. Now, there is issues with that or limitations to it. If I select like I have there, down like this, okay, I won't have just selected these faces on top. I'll also have selected right through my object. So if you're making a selection here, it will select things right down through the model. So that's just something to bear in mind. This form of selection can be very handy. For example, I can get all of these top faces very quickly by looking at the side, selecting the top faces and the side faces, and then holding Shift and dragging through the sides, and I will have just left the top faces. So it's probably the fastest way of selecting these top faces, but if you misclick or if your selection drags over more than you're meant to, you can end up with more than just the top selected. Okay, so bear in mind the marquee tool will select right through your object. The next way of selecting things is, that will apply to edges as well. Whenever you're selecting edges or vertices, it will select vertices right through the model. So if I just try and select these 4 vertices here, I will also have selected all the vertices underneath that were in that marquee selection. Just bear in mind that. The next thing is using tab. So with face selected, I can hold tab, and you'll see I get a little plus icon, and I can just hold my left click and I can tab to paint around this selection. Now this won't paint right through the model, so it means I'll only select what I can see with tab. Very, very handy. The same thing works for edges, where I can hold tab and I can just select these edges, or I could hold tab and I could select around the edge here. Okay, and if I accidentally make a selection, like I accidentally select some of these edges, I can undo that by holding tab, and then the minus icon will show up on currently selected edges and then let go. Same thing works for faces. I can use tab to select, and I can hold tab to deselect. Okay, if you're not holding tab, what will happen is Shift will be the modifier to deselect individual edges. Same thing works for vertices. If I have vertices selected, holding Shift, I can deselect certain vertices. And also tab can paint select vertices. So we're going to look at a few common tools now and 2 different workflows for creating the same objects. So one of those would be using your Extrude tool. So I'm going to go into my side view here, And what I can do is I'm going to use 4 to see through my model. It's 4 on my keyboard. Selecting faces, I'm going to select a round marquee around the top and sides of this, then hold shift and drag through to deselect the sides. So I've only got the top selected here. And one way that I can create the shape is by moving and then scaling my edge, sorry, my faces that are selected here, then using the extrude tool here, or Control and E, then moving and scaling, then pressing G to use the last tool selected, or again you could use your extrude tool, again using W to move, R to scale, then G to repeat the extrusion, W to move, R to scale if need to be, which I don't here, G to use the last tool, W to move, then R to scale. And I'm scaling in from the central on all axis using this little this little gizmo here. Then again G, W to move it up to the next part, and R to scale. And what I'm doing here is I'm just looking at the details of my reference image, and I'm effectively tracing those by using each extrusion. So every time there's a change in the surface here, I'm making a new extrusion G, then I'm moving it up to the next point, which will be about here, R to scale, and I'm moving that out. Then making another extrusion W to move, R to move that out. Okay, so I'll keep doing this a wee second and I'll show you how I can make this shape. Now here's where the extrusion workflow can be tricky, is now that I've created some complexity into my shape, moving all of these edges can be quite tricky. So I would need to use edge or face selection. Just got my W tool selected there, face, I'm going to drag around these. So I would need to start moving these parts into position. Okay, you can see this is tilted as well, so I would need to start tilting this. Maybe scaling it a wee bit to fit in with my reference. And again, I could grab all of this then next maybe and tilt it first of all, and then W to move that over. You can see now this part, which is meant to start here because it's been tilted, is different, so I'm going to need to scale, and that's not going to even scale properly on this axis. What I can do is double click on my scale tool and change it from axis orientation object down to component, and then it will now orient about the component that I have selected, so I can scale it straight up. This is really, really handy, so that if you've already rotated something, you can scale it properly without it stretching the object. So after I've done that, I'm just going to go and turn my axis orientation back to either world or object. It's going to be tricky to line all of this up the way it is with my reference now, but you can see how I would go about doing that, and the result is a model that looks something like that. So that's extrusion modeling. What I'm going to do is select this object. Another window that we can open is Windows and then Outliner, and you'll see I have this model named as P-Cylinder 1. I'm going to rename that by double clicking it and calling it, I'm just going to call it Extrusion, and what is this, a pillar. Okay, so that I know which one that is, and I'm going to redo it again using a different method. So Control and H will hide that, and then what I can do is open my outliner again and press Shift and H to show it again. So it's Control and H to hide something, then select it and Shift and H to show it. Now, before I go about showing you the other way that this could be modeled, there is a way that extrusion modeling could work for me here. If instead of using my front view, I use my side view. Just press number 4 there for wireframe display. What I can do is, I'm going to go into face selection and again select my top by selecting the top and sides and deselecting the sides with Shift. What I could do is just model it up a wee bit smarter. So if I use E here to rotate, and I can use this outside tool, or I can use this outside circle, and it'll always rotate it perfectly on this axis. Okay, R, I'm going to scale in from the center there, okay, to match that. Then I can use my extrusion tool, R to scale up a wee bit, W to move, then extrude again. I can press G to repeat. Okay, and you'll see if I model it from this perspective, I won't have the problems that I had modeling from my front perspective, so choosing which side to model from can be really important, and this would be more accurate. So what I'll do is I'll just model up to about here and show you how this works. So you can see here it has been possible to model. Now my views aren't perfect from my concept drawing, but they're near enough. And you see there, that would be very difficult to model in this view. You can see the way these circles are all overlapping each other, these extrusions are all overlapping, but from my side view I was able to model something accurately, which ends up in a better result here. It would take ages of rotating all of those different edge loops to have got that done from my front view extrusions. Okay, so whenever you're doing extrusion modeling, think about what the best perspective would be for each extrusion to make sure you get an accurate representation of what you're modeling. So all I was using there was the extrusion tool, G to repeat the extrusion, R to scale, and W to move each extrusion as I completed them. Now remember to use the extrude tool on faces, okay, with these faces selected. Never use the extrude tool on edges like this. If I do, what will happen is I'll get a edge that spins out from the let's see, if I just move this out here, this edge will have no normals on the inside, and it will leave these faces behind here, okay, which is not what you want. So this is starting to create non-manifold geometry, which is definitely not what you want. These problems are a real pain in the backside to fix. You'll often find if you've selected an edge and then extruded in the middle of your model somewhere, that you will end up with all sorts of problems later on when you're UVing and you're texturing. So please only use the extrude tool whenever you have faces selected, and that's absolutely fine. Not whenever you have edges. The one exception to that rule would be if I delete these faces here so that I have an open face, alright, so the edges aren't connected to anything. Okay, I can then use the extrude tool to extrude those edges out. That's fine. It's the only time that you can use edge extrusion is when there's no geometry on the top or on the inside. So if you just basically got a hole that you're going to fill later on, that's okay. But whenever you have complete geometry like this, you never extrude the edges. It'll only cause you a headache later on. Just looking at the two objects that I came up with, both using extrusion modeling, but one from a different view, you can see how this one ended up so much more accurate according to my concept art than this one, because I was mistaking the thickness of the extrusions tilted as the thickness of these joints, whenever they were actually a lot skinnier, and it was simply an error from that perspective. Now just quickly, the other way of modeling is by inserting edge loops. So if I select my object here, go to face mode, I'm going to select those faces on top, I'm going to extrude those up, I'm going to go into wireframe mode and just pull in the top faces here to be about the width of that. Okay, now what I can do is I can add in subdivisions with mesh tools and insert edge loop, and this will allow me to add in edge loops across the model that I can then go in and edit. So let's do that. Now I'll start with this one here. I'll insert an edge loop. I will use my E tool to rotate, my W tool to move, and I can move that over that edge there, just to match that up. Then I can use my insert edge loop tool again and click on my edges I want to put the loop in, and use E to rotate, W to move, and move that there. Okay, and then I'm going to select these faces on top here. I'm going to move them into position 2. Use an E to rotate. This is all done in my side view for the moment. Okay, so that's another way we can make up the basic shape by using the edge loops. Now you'll see if we go to add in edge loops along the side here, they won't always line up. Sometimes they will match up with our reference, but you see even here that's not lining up exactly. So I could go ahead and put those in and then rotate them. Or what I can do is use the multi-cut tool. Now the multi-cut tool is really handy for drawing shapes and for connecting vertices. All you need to do is click a vertice, click another vertice, and then press enter to create an edge. But what we're going to use this for is drawing edge loops, and you can do that by clicking, left clicking, holding, and then dragging through your object, and it will slice. It will put a slice right through the object, adding an edge loop around it. Now just make sure when you're doing that, you don't overlap an edge that already exists, because if I do that, I'll start to create triangles and things that I don't want in my model, which would be really messy geometry. So try and avoid that if at all possible. And I wouldn't use it in my perspective view either, because if I try to put an edge loop through, it will not be straight. Okay, so just bear in mind the limitations of using the multi-cut tool here. But the multi-cut tool is that little knife icon, or you can go to mesh tools and multi-cut. You see I can drag right through from either my side view or my front view or the top view, and I can add in nice neat loops. Okay, so I'm going to do that here, and I'm going to add in the loops for the thickness of these things here. And what I can do here is I can use my edge selection to double click to select that entire edge. I'm going to hold shift and double click this edge as well, and Now using R to scale, what will happen normally is I'll scale up and it'll not scale perfectly to out from the object. Especially if I pull on this, you see that it kind of like distorts it and warps it. So another way that we can do that is we'll select world. You see that doesn't change very much. Select component and it will orient it around the component, which is a really handy way to start scaling things. So I'm going to have component mode selected in the axis orientation. And again, to go into tool settings, you just double click your tool, like your rotate tool, and change that axis orientation around. And then I can do the same here. I can just get my move tool selected. And I'm going to go into component. It'll shift that about a wee bit, and then I can scale that up nicely. Okay, and this component selection is really handy whenever you want to say move an edge like this. So I'm going to use my move tool here. I'm going to double click to go into move tool. And you can see I was hoping the component tool would actually be able to draw this directly up along the edges that are currently there, but it's taken it off at a slight angle. So if I wanted to say move this directly up the shape without editing the rest of it, what I would do is go into transform constraint and put that onto edge, and that will actually allow me to slide this edge up without editing the geometry too much. Okay, so that's putting on slide. Just turn that off again. And you can actually hold control and shift and that will do the same thing. It allows you to slide edge loops along the edges without interrupting the shape that you've just built. The extrude and the edge loop tools can be used in a whole bunch of different ways. So say this was a side of a house that has a door here and has a window here. I could try to extrude from this face and then use my R tool to scale down. I'm going to use this pad to scale down on both of those axes. Then I could move this over here and I could kind of resize it to whatever shape that window is going to be. And then you could use your extrude tool again, move that out, use it again, move that in, use it again, move that in to get your kind of like window shape, and then you could, maybe you're going to delete that, you're going to be able to see inside the house. Okay, that would be one way of making a window in your wall. Now the problem is going to be here. Okay, I need to get a door in here, and I've got these edges that are stretching the whole way to the corners of the house. It's going to create triangles, so even if I go into the side mode, okay, and I use that multi-cut tool technique that I showed you, because if I use the insert edge loop, the edge loops are going to go all wonky because of the way these lines are, the way these edges are. So if I use my multi-cut tool, I could technically just multi-cut and cut down through, and then like cut through here to create this doorway. Okay, and then I can extrude that if I wanted to make edges or delete or whatever. But that has created a whole bunch of problems for me here. I've got a triangle here, I've got that's a quad, I've got a triangle up here, triangle here. Okay, so really not ideal. Another way of doing that would be, instead of extruding it all, using the multi-cut tool here to, the insert edge loop tool to insert edge loops to my model exactly where I want the windows to be, and then add in where my door is going to be. And then I can simply say the door's at a different height, which should be fine. Put that there. I can then go into face mode, W. I can do my extrusions if I want to, make this protrude a wee bit, and I can delete those. And that's a lot handier. Now you'll get extra geometry because these loops will go the whole way around the house. That's not such a bad thing either. You have more geometry to go by if you want to start cutting other things out. You can obviously edit those edges and things as you may. So there's advantages and disadvantages to using both, and they're really circumstantial. It depends on what job you have to do. So there are some of the basics. I'll be interested to see how you use your subdivision and your extruding workflow.